We are joined today again by a good friend and comrade of mine, colleague, I guess, as what we would call ourselves, Alex Aviña, who is at the American Studies Association, Arizona State University, where he's in history. How is the field of history these days in times of genocide and war?
It's not good, Nick. Not good. I wish I was in American Studies. But yeah, things are not going well. We can talk about that if you want. There's stuff that's been happening, the American Historical Association, and I'm actually just ran for a position. Working with people like organizations like Historians for Palestine. But
at the AHA, right? The American Historical.
Yeah, the main professional organization for historians, mostly within the U.S. but also outside of. We just had an election that voting closed on the 15th, so a couple of days ago, and there was a slate. Several organizations like Historians for Peace and Democracy, or Democracy. I always mess up these names, but Historians for Palestine. Several organizations put together a slate of candidates, and I was put on one of the nomination council positions. So we'll see. I don't know when we find out what the electoral results, but we had pretty much candidates at from president all the way down to nominating council, because of the shady shenanigans that the AHA leadership has pulled on historians who want action on Palestine over the last couple of years. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, this is kind of like part of a recent push amongst different professional associations, scholarly associations. So, for example, Native American Indigenous Studies Association, we issued, I think now we have 3 statements on Palestine, one about the intensification of the genocide since October 7th, 2023. As part of the American Studies Association, I joined like the year that they passed the boycott resolution, which is pretty wild. I served on council, and as I was going out of council, it was almost a decade later, they were still dealing with, the legal fallout from that. So there has been a sustained attack. And, this is, as I think there's kind of this view that scholars kind of, live in this world, this rarefied world of privilege and prestige, and that we sort of are given free reign. And we see this kind of attack on universities as one of the primary targets of the Trump administration. But, I think what's fascinating about this current moment is the attacks. Sure, there's executive orders coming out. There's funding that's being withdrawn. But who are the henchmen carrying out these particular actions? It's typically liberal and neoliberal university administrators. And it really kind of gestures toward this idea that somehow we imagine that there's going to be this bulwark of defense against America's, institutions, its democratic institutions, the university being one of them. And this is where, there's a free flow of ideas, and we have a large international student body that comes here to get this high quality education. But we can see it now sort of being dwindled away, piece by piece, brick by brick, program by program. And the people who are doing this, and I can speak, from my own personal experience here at the University of Minnesota, it's not reactionary kind of right-wing ideologues who want to destroy the American university. It's actually liberals, many of whom are aligned with the Democratic Party establishment within this state, using the cover of executive orders and the Trump regime as a reason to dismantle and take apart things that they wanted to do. I don't know if you have any perspectives on the world of history and how they're dealing with it.
Well, I tell my students, I have a quote from this Australian anthropologist / historian, Inga Clendenin, who she's passed, but she had an entire career based on studying Mayan peoples, Mexica peoples. And she has an article on Hernan Cortez's conquest of the Mexica. Well, Hernan Cortez plus 200,000 indigenous allies. Conquest of Mexica. And she has a quote in that article where she says, historians are the camp followers of the imperialists. I keep coming back to that quote. Like, I use that for teaching, but in the last couple of years, I keep coming back to that quote, applying it to real life, applying it to what has happened within historians' professional organizations like the AHA. When we tried to pass a resolution that was really mild condemnation of like scholasticide last January. It overwhelmingly passed, but leadership decided not to follow through on it. They took some really shady authoritarian decisions to not allow for the AHA to publish and to support this resolution that was overwhelmingly backed by people who voted for it. Present at the American Historical Association annual Congress, this big Congress that happens once a year. Yeah, and I think you're right. I think, we saw this a little bit. I mean, there's a long history about this, right? One of my favorite things that I show students too is this cover from the American Legion magazine from like during the second Red Scare. And it's like, Red professors, can we get rid of them or can we fire them or something like that? Which is so good, right? But during the first Trump administration, we saw how the reactionaries were priming an attack on academia, knowing full well or expecting that these liberal institutions would bend over backwards to facilitate these attacks, either because of ideological affinity or because they are just totally unprepared, right? Like the way they see the world, the way that they operate in this world is completely unprepared to deal with reactionary attacks. So even if they're not ideologically aligned with these reactionaries, they end up being on the same side because they don't know how to push back and they're afraid to push back. We saw this with the case of Giomar, who got fired from Drexel University because of tweets, right? And one tweet referenced white genocide. And when people started, his university thought that white genocide was an actual thing. When people called and started complaining about his tweets, the university thought that like white genocide was a real thing, right? So they were so unprepared. And now it's beyond lack of preparedness. Now I think you're right. Now I think it's like there's serious ideological affinity between these reactionary attacks and certain neoliberal considerations of what they want to do to higher ed and what they want higher ed to do, and fundamentally what they want a university to be. Is a university a place of learning between professors and staff and students, or is it a neoliberal vehicle of capital accumulation where you have universities like mine, where it seems to be a real estate company with a university attached? And that's the real struggle, right? And these liberal institutions, I think in many ways have used the genocide in Gaza as a way to crack down on dissent within their universities. And that then allows them, with the help of the Trump administration, to further some of their neoliberal goals to radically transform universities. In our view, I mentioned, not to speak for you, but in my view, it's to destroy what a university is supposed to be. And I think that's why one reason why universities are an important axis of struggle currently.
Yeah, I think, there's a lot to say about that. I mean, I haven't really been, frankly don't really know if you can decolonize a university, especially like a university like mine that's literally just founded on the genocide of my people. And it still profits from that. I mean, there's a bank account. They literally kept the genocide, it's like the blood account. They kept it, and it's like still producing and producing interest that they're reaping profits from. And there's no strategic reason for them to give any of those resources back to Native people, or to, unless they're forced, that's a whole nother story. And my view is, maybe I'm a little more pessimistic, but I think that they see this as an opportunity. I mean, even looking at the crackdown that happened under the Biden administration, when the conditions were quote unquote more favorable, the investigations, the Department of Education investigations that are ongoing were actually initiated, during the Biden administration, are carrying forward in the Trump administration. So if they want to use the excuse of national politics, it doesn't really fly, because these processes were initiated under a different and more, quote unquote, favorable political climate. So my view is that it's a little more pessimistic, and to say that this is something that they've always wanted to do. And so they are going to go ham, and they might silence or attempt to silence their critics or assuage them to say, well, our hands are tied because of the current, the political situation at the national level. And this gets to another kind of a point that a topic of discussion that I want to talk about with a group of scholars, you and I among them, who have come together to form the Anti-Imperialist Scholar Collective. I think by the time this podcast comes out, we will have launched the website and have done a sort of a formal soft launch or hard launch. I don't know the difference between what a soft and hard launch is.
Come on, man. You've had your show now for years. You should know this kind of stuff.
I think one is like where you, I'm not going to even go there. But,
yeah, don't try.
anyways, there's a good group of comrades in this collective. I mean, geographically speaking, we're all over the world, and representing different communities and national liberation struggles, if you want to call them that. But maybe you can kind of give us a little bit of background on what this the acronym is AISC. And our website is anti-imperial. Is it anti-imperialism or is it anti-imperialist?
I think it's anti-imperialist.com.
Okay, so yeah, we have the .com, anti-imperialist, anti-imperialist.com.
This is what happens when they allow us to do tech stuff. Yeah, so I think I was invited to form part of this collective probably around the same time as you, Nick. Maybe a few years ago. I think the pandemic, it was still like during Zoom time. So must have been during pandemic times, but it's the official description is that we are a organization of scholars, educators, and knowledge workers engaged in the battle of ideas to support the forces of liberation and justice around the world. And we see anti-imperialism as a primary contradiction. And yeah, we have a great group of really not just like brilliant folks, but also very courageous folks, scholars who have and who continue to face attacks within and without their institutions. But it's a really interesting, smart, brilliant cohort of committed scholars and intellectuals who I think we can say we don't view we don't think about some sort of artificial separation between the classroom and the world. We want our knowledge and our knowledge production to have an impact within classrooms, but also beyond, in the service of liberation, in the service of justice, particularly in this current time of monsters. So one of the, and we can talk about this too, Nick, because I know we've chatted about this before, but contrary to what some Democrats and some Republicans say, academics are not working in socialism factories. We are not a bunch of Marxists. I know, right? Every time I see that, I'm like, God, I wish I could check in at the socialism factory every day. I think it's growing. I think because of the genocide in Gaza, we have seen increasing numbers of scholars come out and take a brave public stand and think about our role as educators within and without classroom university buildings, etc. And it was one of the things I really appreciate about this group of scholars. They're brilliant knowledge producers, knowledge workers, but they're also politically engaged and committed in a way that I find really inspiring. And that's what we need. That's what we need in these times. This is not a time for timidity. This is not a time for hiding in our offices. This is not, because honestly, like, this collective will do more to back our comrades than their institutions will. And we've seen that. These institutions love, particularly with scholars of color, they love putting us on brochures to recruit students. But then the moment we do something that makes them mad, us and our families get photoshopped out of those brochures, and we can't be used to lure students into these universities. So we'll see. We have a website. I'm not going to try to do the distinction in launching either, Nick, but we have some really good blog posts that will be up. And yeah, I think we're going to have meetings, conferences. We're going to have stuff published I think on a monthly basis online. And we look to interface with other organizations as well.
Yeah. And I think, this collective has already been operating as a collective, even without this sort of formal launch. There's a group, like, I think Middle East Critique has been kind of a journal where some of these scholars have published. There's other places. I mean, we all kind of live in this podcast ecosphere too of, academics and whatnot. But I also think what's more important about this collective, it's a resource for me because, I understand imperialism, I think, from a perspective of my field, which is history and American Indian studies and indigenous studies. But I also think in those fields, they're very underdeveloped and they don't really speak in my sort of subfields, and it can seem sort of hermetically sealed in terms of the conversations that are happening. And we had Francis Hasso on the podcast, and she wrote this article, or she gave this talk about how women's studies and gender studies departments had basically facilitated reproducing imperialist sort of narratives around liberation movements, whether, and she looked specifically at Palestine and like how these liberation movements were like supposedly anti-feminist or anti-women. And she's kind of critiques that from this anti-imperialist lens, which I thought was very brave. And I don't really have those tools in my sort of, toolbox when I went through grad school to like respond to some of these attacks on indigenous movements or left movements to say, that they're anti-indigenous. First of all, like that's a common trope, like across the board, is that all communist and leftist movements kind of descend, especially in Latin America, descend into some sort of chauvinism or anti-indigeneity, without really realizing like how empire kind of plays up those divisions, and how there are State Department funded publications and scholars who actually go about making a career off of promoting these narratives. And so it demonstrates on one hand the power of intellectual knowledge production to carry out empire and statecraft in that sense, but it also demonstrates the power of counter-hegemonic or anti-imperialist narratives to provide a counterbalance to that, and to provide a space and to fight for a space, because these are spaces of contestation. And we can't do it alone. I mean, there's this whole idea that we're supposed to like combat these institutions in our fields alone, but really, we're always in conversation, whether it's formal emails, Zoom meetings, reviewing each other's papers, or just, having a text back and forth about the context of an event and how to think through it, not as individuals, but as collective, as a collective response, and how do we integrate that into our scholarship. So it's been an immense resource for me to kind of find a home there. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add about this.
No, I'm with you on that. I mean, it's knowledge production is a social activity, and it should be a collaborative activity, right? And I always think of I think it's Walter Rodney's preface to, which book was it of his, where he says that like, I'm not going to say all heirs are my own because that's bourgeois subjectivism. And then he lists off like, it might be his classic book on Africa, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. But
it is.
And he says, all heirs are not he says, I'm not going to say all heirs are my own because that's bourgeois subjectivism. And then he lists off all the people that he'd been interfacing with and in conversation with to collaborate in collaborative fashion, revolutionary fashion, produce new knowledge, right? To critique European-led imperialism during the night in that particular moment that he was writing in. So I think I think you're right. That's one of the best aspects of this group, and one of the reasons why I feel grateful to have been invited to even form part of the group in the beginning. I like the part where you said we're supposed to do this type of radical critique on our own, right? Like, which is an impossibility. So the fact that we have a collective and an organization of committed individuals who have all sorts of differences, right? Intellectual, political, whatever, but we still in collaborative fashion can come together and put together and create some really good stuff. And I've learned a lot as well, right? I think the fact that this group also allows us to push beyond, I'm not going to say decolonize, but to push beyond like some of the rigid, methodological, geographical boundaries that are kind of instilled in us as we're trained academically, So that's also, for me, it's been an amazing learning experience to kind of smash some of those borders down and to learn from other areas, just as in a way that's similar to what you were describing.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned Walter Rodney, because there's this tendency, I think, within our fields, they call them area studies. I'm only reminded of this when I talk to historians, not you, but others. They'll be like, "So you're a Latin Americanist or an African?" It's like, what the fuck? It's like, this is like the 1950s, like, like
State Department 1950s.
No, yeah. It's like, are you serious? Like, are you being serious right now? But anyways, I gave a talk at a history department relatively recently, and they were saying that, and I'm a Caribbeanist, and I was like, do you really want to call yourself that? Like, anyways, besides the point. But we're supposed to, like, there's intellectual giants within those fields, and there's a canon, and we have to reference the canon, we have to critique the canon. But I find that sort of unhelpful in advancing struggle and study. And I find somebody like Walter Rodney, the applicability of his theories and his practice of study, and this, the practice of history, but also of being a revolutionary himself, very inspiring to my own work, and something that I aspire to become. I don't know if I could ever be as great as Walter Rodney, but his work is really a testament to the kind of work that we are, trying to emulate for our students and for our colleagues, and I hope, in this collective, because you can't just take a neutral position, right? Every position is loaded with the idea that, like, there are many imperialisms. We hear this a lot in our fields. Like, there's Chinese imperialism, there's Russian imperialism, really clouds the thinking of, like, well, none of these so-called imperialisms have over 900 overseas, military bases. This is something that is very unique. They don't have the dominance of the dollar. There are three things that make imperialism. One is, productive capacity. Yes, the United States doesn't have that anymore. It's been largely outsourced to China. The second is the power of their currency, which they do. The dollar is still dominant, and kinetic military power, which those two forms are very dangerous and very coercive forms within how we understand whether it's soft power or hard power, in the world of geopolitics. So you can't ignore that. There are no Chinese aircrafts, in the Bay Area, like there are, U.S. aircrafts in the Pacific surrounding China, right? There's just not that, like, these are not the same. So I think having that clarity, that intellectual and just truth, it's like factual clarity. Oh, go ahead.
So you're not convinced by the sub-imperialism argument?
Well, yeah, no, we do. There are submarines that participate in. No, I'm just kidding.
Yes. No, but I think you use the correct word, I think, to help us understand it. Like, how do we fundamentally understand power? And there's within history and historiography, right? The idea that really starts with on a larger scale, like really pushed by national liberation movements and the U.S. civil rights movement at home, was like the idea that historians could kind of recapture or represent agency, right? The agency of the oppressed, trying to save everyday working class people from the condescension of posterity, as to misquote E.P. Thompson. But what's really interesting about, and that was like a worthwhile endeavor. I mean, in many ways, that's why I wanted to be a historian, right? Like, I thought I could give voice to the voiceless, right? The thing that has happened in the last, let's say, three decades at least, is how those arguments have been repurposed by certain liberals and reactionaries to kind of muddle the how power actually operates, both on a global and on a local scale. And to kind of muddle the picture of how power actually works under the cover of terms like agency, complexity, nuance, et cetera, right? So the field of Cold War Latin America, for instance, right? There's been a lot of debate about how much power U.S. empire was able to exercise in the region, right? So there was a more moderate and reactionary position that said, well, if you say that the U.S. exercised power and domination and imperialism over Latin America in the Cold War, then you're robbing Latin Americans and Latin American nations of their agency. One guy who wrote a book about using this argument, who is now an endowed chair that's named after Henry Kissinger, like, they know what they're doing, right? Like, they're using terms and ideas and concepts that emerged, I think, in a really promising, potentially even revolutionary way when we think about methodology and intellectual production. But then they repurpose it to kind of really muddle the field in terms of how power works at the global scale, through empire and through imperialism and through colonialism, but also at the national and the local levels. So we're left with, people. Greg Grandin will publish a book, and the reviews will be like, well, he castigates the U.S. for everything, and he doesn't really pay attention to left authoritarianism in Latin America. And it's like, again, like, how the fuck does power work? There's a scale here, right? Like, there's a scale of and gradations of how power works and what power looks like at different levels, right? And I feel like that's one of the main issues that we as a collective, and maybe you individually with your work and my work, that we struggle against. Like, how do we push back against these bad faith arguments that use potentially revolutionary concepts and ideas to kind of muddle the field and to push through confusion in terms of how power actually works right now globally? And I think that's, we see why they're doing that. A lot of this stuff happens with the so-called postmodern turn, right? Like, there's been a lot of stuff written about how the cultural logics of postmodernism, eerily parallel or resemble actual like neoliberal imperial logics that started to take off in the 80s and 90s. But I think that's what this is about. It's about power, and how does power function, and can we actually identify institutions that are exercising power in certain ways? Can we identify structures that are involved in power production and domination and oppression? Or are we left with some idea that power is diffuse and it's everywhere? And, but without, I'll stop there before we start, naming names, but.
But it's a very relevant topic, because somehow I think of like American historians. I mean, you read like the major literary magazines, the Atlantic, the New Yorker, and you have a lot of American historians who write for these magazines and these outlets, the New York Times, and they'll say like, the United States was a settler colonial nation. It committed genocide, enslaved African people, annexed, a third of Mexico, did all these things, but it's tending, it's a nuanced kind of project. So, it'll like give rights eventually, but that's never called liberal authoritarianism, right? But then you look at like, Bolivia or Venezuela, they love Venezuela and Cuba, where they're saying, this isn't a left authoritarianism. The nuance that they grant themselves to commit genocide and chattel slavery is never granted to those who are actually trying to build social projects, however flawed they might be. Their intentions and their execution is always suspect. And I think it just shows you the sort of intellectual bankruptcy of these kinds of arguments. And then the result of it is that we have students, we have a general kind of public who's completely uneducated about these places. Like, I just find it fascinating that, I went through public education and I don't know anything about China in my public education. We never talked about China other than they harvested organs or, some absurd, fantastical, suspect kind of like claim that they're this kind of authoritarian thing. And then they become the stand-in for like, let's not become like those authoritarian Asians. Let's not become like those authoritarian Latin Americans. And that's all the average person knows. And it's like, it's actually, I think it's incredibly, it's obviously very dangerous, because that manufacturing of consent and dehumanization towards an entire group of people, an entire civilization, it results in the sanctioning of places like Iran. It results in the genocidal blockade against Cuba. It results in the genocidal slaughter of Palestinians. And there's you can follow the receipts. You can say that you can say as much as you want. Oh, I'm just, I'm in the academy, I'm looking at nuanced arguments, but you are legitimating. And I see this, I'm speaking from personal experience, because I've seen this in cases of the Red Power movement, where historians and scholars will offer a critical voice of often the male leadership within the Red Power movement, thinking that they're being nuanced and whatnot. And sometimes they compare their violence and power to that of the FBI. And when they do that, and I've seen this actually argued by DOJ attorneys, by the FBI themselves, citing these very scholars, to make the argument that the American Indian movement and the Red Power movement was a criminal organization that was engaged in violence. And those of you who hate me, you get emails from me saying, look, you're cited in this DOJ report.
Congratulations. Congratulations. You've been cited by the DOJ. Yeah, man.
But I've been, since I got tenure, I've been a little bit more, I'm not aggressive. I'm just transparent. I'm just like, hey, this is how your work's being used. Do you what's your response to this? How you say your framing is nuanced and you're like a feminist or whatever, but you're actually contributing to the criminalization of Native people, so, but anyways,
that's really interesting. I think Well, yeah, there's a bunch of things we could say, but the point you made about like public education. Well, the first point you made about, you know, flaws or mistakes or instances of violence that were involved in the creation of U.S. empire are seen as like unintentional consequences or just kind of one-offs or just flaws that say nothing about this original project. Whereas when it happens in an enemy regime, it's like existential and it's innate, right, to that project. And there's almost like there's a determinist teleological aspect to U.S. based analyses of political projects in the global South that are deemed to be quote unquote authoritarianism, right? When perhaps the analytical lens should be kind of reversed. But those countries, those political projects are never granted this space to fuck up, right? Like they're not granted this space to make mistakes, because the moment they do, that's indicative of a broader structural existential flaw that was always there. And in many ways, that's like central to like both modern conservatism, well, to the modern conservative movement that goes back to like Edmund Burke and his take on the French Revolution, but also to liberals, right? Particularly during the Cold War. And it's really interesting. I remember I teach a US empire class, and toward the beginning of the class, I will show students the beginning of the Ken Burns documentary on the Vietnam War, which I don't recommend. I could not finish all 20 million hours of it. But the way that Tom Hanks, the narrator, with folksy Tom Hanks, who could hate him, the way he frames the war in the introductory episode is like good people with good, he said people with good intentions made bad mistakes or some shit like that, which is like, how can you make that argument, right? If you know the history of like French colonialism in the region and then how they just kind of handed it off to the Americans. Everything's reduced to mistakes. Everything is reduced to intentionality and unintended consequences. But that grace or that ability is never granted to political projects and governments deemed to be enemy regimes, because they're enemy regimes, right? So they have to be castigated as an existential enemy that are hell-bent on the destruction of the U.S., as in contrast to, as you mentioned, right, the U.S. is the one that has 900 military bases around the world with a military expenditure that like far outpaces anybody else. But we're supposed to be scared of a Chinese red government that's trafficking drugs into the United States as a way to undermine us from within. And that's been that's from the 1950s. Like you have senators from the 1950s saying the Reds are using dope to bring down the U.S. So yeah, one way I think to push back against that is just really basic history, right? The kind of stuff that we don't get in public education, K through 12. Like I'm always astounded that my students don't even, that US-Mexico border, for instance, is not just like an actual geographic political border. It's like an intellectual, epistemological border. And whenever I teach the history of Mexico class or US empire class, and we get to the US-Mexico war, the reaction's always the same. Like we never learned about how the U.S. invaded Mexico in a war of conquest and aggression and took between 1/3 to 1/2 of Mexico's national territory. Well, I wonder why that is, right? I mean, even the way that it's described in U.S. history textbooks is the Mexican-American War. It makes it seem like it's a Chicano civil war. It did not like a war between the Mexicans and the United States, right? And even by saying war, it's this weird false equivalency in which you're not really allowed to understand who started what. And it was a war of conquest. It was a war of imperialism. So I don't know. I think
it was a war for slavery. It was a dress rehearsal for the Civil War too, in many ways. Like, and it's never talked about. I mean, Gerald Horne has kind of done some of that work, but it's like, it's never talked about in that context either, that it was like as part of this counter-revolutionary kind of trend from the very beginning that was trying to prevent abolition at all turns and to maintain a very profitable system of not just chattel slavery, but the expansion of that plantation system.
It was totally and some of the good historians of the U.S., good historians of slavery in the Deep South, have shown that, right, that the Confederacy or what becomes a Confederacy was a deeply expansionist project, just like the U.S., right? Like it depends on expansion for survival. It depends on constantly displacing internal class contradictions onto the so-called frontier, which is now the border, right? So yeah, I mean, it was deeply expansionist, related to the dynamics of slavery, and it's hugely consequential for the development of the U.S., right? Like it's an incredibly important hinge point in the history of the United States that like just gets kind of not covered in your K through 12 history, or it's briefly mentioned in a very neutral, equivalent way, without saying like, look, this is the foundation of a transcontinental US empire. And in another way, it really nicely sets up what ends up happening in the Civil War.
I think the other part of this is, I was thinking about like when you're talking about Vietnam, and when I really started, I read, I think it was Manufacturing Consent actually at a young age. I didn't fully understand everything. I mean, I was like, it's like going into an advanced writing course and you don't even know how to create like a prop. You don't even know tenses and verbs, like
that's never happened to me before. No.
But it's like, so I was like reading Chomsky and I was like, I don't even know what, I read The Fateful Triangle when I was in high school and I was talking about Palestine. People were just looking at me like a terrorist because it's like, like 9/11 just happened. But anyways, the point I'm trying to make, when I was reading that book, I was like, in my mind, I was like, I remember as a kid, I was like, what did Vietnam ever do to the United States?
Yeah.
And like in the description, and I went back and I read an encyclopedia, and it's like, it's a peasant, economy. It was like, so what threat did it pose that required this, military intervention that killed millions of people? Like, why is it that and then also why were these people who sustained themselves, who many of their fighters didn't even have guns, they just had like mock rifles. How did they defeat this powerful army? Like it made me think a lot about like, oh wow, this isn't just about Vietnam, it's about stopping the spread of an alternative system. It's not only to kill Vietnamese, it's also to tell people in the United States, the civil rights movement, the Chicano movement, the power movements that were happening, the student movement, that, any alternative to the capitalist mode of production is going to be met with genocidal violence. Like, it was a direct threat. Like, there are deep, like this, it's not just a game of like, and the Tom Hanks is like unintended consequences. It also diminishes the intent and the calculation behind, this sort of genocidal violence. We see that also in Gaza right now, like how we have these liberals who are like, this isn't the American way. Like, this is against, free speech. Like we should be able, and it's like, no, like why is it that they're targeting this place, that has been a concentration? It's a literal concentration camp. Nobody wants to use that word because it's somehow, that is even seen as anti-Semitic. They'll say like, well, it's, Holocaust denial. It's like, the Nazis these ideas didn't just drop from, the sky. They were reading colonial history. And in fact, the early sort of historians of the Holocaust talked about, they called this the colonization. They called it settler colonialism of Eastern Europe because they had to draw the parallels from European colonialism elsewhere because that's where it originated, so this idea that like somehow we enter these moments of like 21st century barbarism, and that we're hearkening back to a 19th century exterminationist campaign. It's like, no, it's actually not. It's these societies are built on genocide. This is what they do. This is how it maintains its control and power. It might seem senseless. Even the sort of liberal, the sympathetic liberal might say this is senseless violence, but it's actually very productive violence if you look at the context, because it's saying to the rest of the world, if you want to de-link from this, this mode of production, if you want your freedom, these are the consequences. Yeah, we see this in the way, and I'll get to your own sort of expertise in this area, but we see this in the way that the United States is sending military advisors in with the IDF, and they're researching the rules of engagement. Because they're understanding this like, obviously they don't think it's a genocide, but they're saying this is the return to normal combat, right? Before we were kind of restricted by counterinsurgency doctrines, by, rules of engagement under the U.S. war on terror. And now this is a full scale war. And so where's the next full scale war going to happen? Probably with a state like China. This is what these military advisors are thinking. So they're looking at the justifications, the legal justifications under international law, which is absurd. I know it sounds absurd, but I've read some of these military reports, and they're saying this could be the sort of the model for a potential great powers conflict with China, where we're no longer restricted by precision bombs, right? I mean, that's an oxymoron.
Yeah.
Precision bomb, like a bomb is exploding. It's about creating, non-precision, and targeted assassinations, drone warfare, all of those things that were sort of developed within the U.S. war on terror. And they're saying, like, now we have to take the gloves off. We have to retire the JAG lawyers. We have to say the chain of command begins with the soldier on the ground to make the decisions of whether it's acceptable to shoot civilians or kill civilians. Like, this is, they're using this as a model, as a laboratory, right? And I think of this in the context of, like, in the domestic sense of what's happening right now. I think Kristi Noem blindsided the nation, which I'm surprised by, because we banned her from all of our reservations for a reason. She was using South Dakota as a laboratory for oppression against Native people specifically, but also she was using what you had just said as, like, deploying the notion of the border, the U.S.-Mexico border specifically, to the idea of reservations, right? Because why was there an influx of fentanyl? Why was there an influx of illicit drug use in South Dakota? I mean, if you look at the stats, non-Native people still to this day use fentanyl and opioids far more than actual Native people. But her idea was that, well, it's all originating from these reservations, because these cartels are using these as sort of hideouts and staging grounds to get white people hooked on drugs. Which is, it's an absurd argument on its face, because, like, it ignores the whole sort of pharmaceutical industry that introduced these drugs to begin with. But in some ways she's right. She's deploying this notion of a kind of terroristic sovereignty of Native people, or savage sovereignty, right? So this is what happens when you give Native people sovereignty. Their reservations become, dens for Mexican cartels to push opioid and fentanyl on white kids. And she was deploying this, like, this was like a huge conversation back home, like, and this is why she got banned. This is why she got banned from the reservation, among other reasons. But we were sounding the alarms about her from the beginning, and so when it made logical sense. I didn't actually think Trump would appoint her to the Department of Homeland Security. But it makes logical sense if you think about it, in the way that she was cracking down on tribal sovereignty and saying, we don't have a border, we don't have an international border with Mexico, but we do have one with these reservations. And so now what we're seeing is her sort of scaling up the strategies and politics that she kind of honed in on when she was the governor of South Dakota, to that of the DHS, the Department of Homeland Security. The Department of Homeland Security, I think people always forget that ICE was it's a product of the U.S. war on terror.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Yeah, and so, like, I know I've been talking a lot, but I'm coming to a point and a question. Because at this moment in time, it's like, ICE never went away. ICE was operating under Biden. It was operating under Obama, and they made their own justifications for it. This is what we have to do. They came in saying, oh, we're going to take apart, maybe suggesting, or having people around them suggesting, these tactics are too aggressive, they're immoral, they're kind of against the rule of law. Like, we want to sort of claw back the power of ICE and doing these deportations and these night raids and et cetera, et cetera. But all of them sort of signed on, to this. And I want to kind of get your perspective on maybe contextualizing ICE within the context of the productive capacity of the U.S.-Mexico border to kind of create, as you call it, the American Maginot Line. And maybe you can tell our listeners what the Maginot Line is if they're not familiar with French history.
Go read French history. No, it's interesting. No, I think, but your point about Noem in South Dakota is really important, right? The idea that her face filler fascism started in South Dakota. I think she also, you're right, in saying that she waged war against tribal sovereignty, but even not being geographically close to the U.S.-Mexico border, she still sent, like, National Guard units and police
Yeah.
to U.S. Mexico border, right? So geography didn't hold her back because she's got border and / frontiers perpetually on her mind, which is, I think, a structural element of the Gringo mind. If we can, they love talking about the Arab mind, the Persian mind, the Chinese mind. So I'm trying to do my work, and I'm talking about the Gringo mind more often until I did get pushback online once that it was a racist slur, which just is the most hilarious thing to me. But they were like, hey, they tagged Elon Musk, right? Elon Musk, can we add gringo to your list of banned racist terms? I'm like, oh my God. Anyway, no, also your point about, well, one, I'll say this, there is no coexistence with the settler colonial project. And I think this is part of the issue with like we need to, if we understand the longue durée history of the United States as a settler colonial project, like the one thing that is a couple elements that are constant, right? War, and the inability to coexist with neighbors, right? And this is why we have 700, 800, 900 military bases around the world. This is why there is a ramping up of, for now more than a decade, a desire to quote unquote pivot toward Asia and to seek some sort of confrontation with China. Like there is no, under the logics and the civilizational thinking of the United States and other similar settler colonial projects, like the one currently waging genocide in West Asia and bombing like 7, 8 of its neighbors, there is no coexistence because it's always expansionist, right? That's at its core, it's expansionist. The irony with Trump is that they said that was done, right? Like we don't want to expand. We're going to build up walls. We're going to keep people out. And this is one of the unstable, I think, contradictions within our current moment in the United States is that there is, in a way, that this imperialist war comes home, right? The boomerang came home and it's being waged against internal populations. It's getting waged against migrant populations. It's getting waged against racialized populations that are identified as migrant just because they're brown, but they're not. And that's been a long feature in the US borderlands. But that expansionism also has not stopped abroad, regardless of this political messaging of America first. Because it's fundamental to its project. It's fundamental to its settler colonial project. It needs to expand for a variety of reasons. It will not coexist, and it will seek a confrontation with China, which I hope with all my being that doesn't happen. Like we have kids, that would be horrific. But it seems to be heading in that direction. While at the same time, they're waging war internally, which in the end, I think will limit the capacity, I hope will limit the capacity of the US government's ability to wage war abroad, right? I think what we're seeing with Trump and his people is a decimation of some of the institutions and communities that enabled their expansionist project to begin with. And it's a really not interesting. It's quite the phenomenon to witness this boomerang. Amy says there's boomerang come home and to see concentration camps yet again, right? Like they never quite went away. And there's you could speak to that better than me. ICE is a colonial police force for a variety of reasons. It's a colonial police force because it's linked to border logics. It's in a way it's an extension of the La Pinche Migra, the U.S. Border Patrol, which is a colonial police force. Whose antecedents before it was formed in 1924 included the Texas Rangers, right? So they've been waging colonial, anti-indigenous, anti-native violence for centuries. That then becomes the Border Patrol, and then ICE becomes just one of like 10 or 11 other let's say broadly defined border police units that exist in the U.S. ICE has been trained abroad in U.S. Colonial theaters of war. ICE has been trained in Israel. In the Palestine laboratory, to use Lowenstein's terminology, to swap quote unquote best practices, right? So it's a colonial police force, and now it's been fully unleashed. They're trying to expand it, and it's been fully unleashed internally. Right now, they're trying to make examples of certain regions, right? They're trying to make an example of Southern California. They're trying to make example of a multicultural, heavily Latino geography that is willing to resist and to fight back. And they're trying to make an example out of them. But, it's been happening throughout the country. And if they can find the people to join this colonial police force, they have the money now to expand these deportation, to expand the detention and deportation machine to a scale that we haven't seen probably since, it's probably unprecedented, but maybe not since like the early 1950s when Eisenhower launched Operation Wetback. but it's also extremely profitable, right? And this is like the writings of people like my comrade Taylor Miller, and she's near here in Tucson at the University of Arizona, who's constantly saying things, reminding me about how borders and border police are also profitable, right? They're also vehicles of capital accumulation when it comes to tech, when it comes to training, when it comes to getting government contracts. And this is where I think reading like someone like Ali Qadri has been really helpful, right? To think about war itself, like broadly define war as a form of capital accumulation, right? I mean, we can go back to people like Rosa Luxemburg writing about this, but I think Ali Qadri provides like a more updated view of how war itself and the constant destruction that goes into war. You would think that war is bad for business, right? That's like the common sense understanding. But, having taught his book recently, and which gave me the chance to finally read it, it's to think about war as it's actually foundational to capital accumulation. It's actually foundational to circulation, to exchange, and the accumulation of capital throughout the world, right? So because of that, that's why it's expanding, right? That's why it's not stopping. And that's why it's been a constant feature in US history, I think. In terms of ICE, I think we should remember also, as you mentioned, it's very new. It's 2001. And, who was the first president who really tested and expanded the capacities of ICE to do what they're doing today? I mean, it was Obama, right? There's a reason why we call him the porter in chief. Except the Democrats, they don't like the spectacle of fascism. They want their deportation and detention machine to be out of sight, out of mind. And they hope that by proving that they're quote unquote tough on the border and migrants, that would somehow convince their political opponents to pass something that is amorphously constantly referred to as comprehensive immigration reform, which is this like thing that's always being dangled, but has not been fulfilled or completed for we're in like decade 4 maybe of talking about so-called comprehensive immigration reform. So this is, ICE is just part of a bipartisan political project, just like US empire is, that they share the same logics, they share the same idea, they share the same premises and presuppositions when it comes to quote unquote border security. And this is one of the things that I've written about and I think about constantly, is that despite the fact that the US Mexico border is the most dangerous place in the world for people trying to cross, it is one of the most highly militarized places in the world. And that militarization has continued exponentially since the 1980s. Billions and billions of dollars, billions and billions on police, on technology, on surveillance, on military hardware, et cetera. The more militarized it becomes, the more out of control and insecure it is in like the political discourse of both political parties in the United States. And there we can kind of see what its political function is. It's what's actually happening on the ground in material reality has no connection to what politicians are saying, because they want the border to be constantly insecure. They want to constantly be able to point to it in a way to kind of frighten and scare the US population that their everyday existence or safety is dependent on whether they crack down on migrants and refugees and asylum seekers who come to the US from the US Mexico border. And I think that's one of the last things that both political parties have to kind of mobilize their voters in both political parties. It's one of the last, especially the Republicans. They lost Epstein now. So all they have now is like, we can scare the shit out of people, the brown evil migrants who are coming in. And all we can do is have, Stephen Miller give his little Nazi speeches about, why we need to crack down on migrants. And really that's all they have left. And ICE, I think, is a fundamental element in that. But again, it's a bipartisan political project. I mean, that's the thing that we're not even getting the photo ops of like, AOC crying at the cages. I mean, we have seen some individual politicians, do brave things like go and try to check out, which I don't know why these would be brave, but they should be doing this anyway. But, these instances of politicians going to try to check out some of the detention centers. And then they get in a tussle with ICE agents, But by and large, the Democrats' response to this face filler fascism, again, to use that term, is to just try to present some sort of lighter human face version of it, which then just keeps us in this tautology, right? Over and over and over, fighting this fight about migration and border security and comprehensive immigration reform.
Yeah, I think you brought up like this notion of war, and I think it was a book called, an article called "The Savage Constitution" that talks about the sort of early debates around creating the U.S. constitutional framework. And there's a concept, his name is Oblofsky, I can't remember his first name. He's a legal scholar. He talks about how the Indian Wars, even the notion of Mexico or the Spanish, he called it the Spanish, empires at the time, really weighed heavily on the drafters of the Constitution, and believing, that they didn't have a military force to kind of check all these empires, but also to aggressively expand. They needed a constant influx of finance. So he calls it the finance military nexus, where the war industry was actually part and parcel to the founding of the United States, to the point, I mean, there's some studies on this about how gun industries were, we think of modern capitalism as kind of being founded within how universal parts are created in the factory systems. Well, the gun industry sort of revolutionized that, right? Especially in this period of intense war with the founding of the United States and these expansionists, you're arming everyday settlers. There was a need for it, and the arms trade has always been fundamental to the United States, its existence, and war making, right? The United States is I think it was 12 years or 9 years, I don't know, where the United States hasn't been at war or in a conflict. Maybe that's not even correct. But we can see from the very beginning that war making is fundamental, and I think people think of that as external, but it's also internal too. It's also preventing, the tools that were sort of or the tactics that were experimented on in the Western frontier were actually used, against the labor movement at the turn of the 19th century. Even the sort of rhetoric of this internal sort of threat of, you have Eastern European immigrants who are coming into the country. They have these kind of backwards civilizational views. They are promoting communism and anarchism, the same language that they were using to describe people on the Western frontier. So there's, the Indian Wars don't really end. They kind of just shift to internal problems. And then, of course, we have the expansionist sort of imperial project of the United States, and its so-called Age of Empire. It's recognized Age of Empire, but really it's been doing this from the very beginning. And I did like how it is, ICE is a colonial police force. And I think there's something a little bit more to it that Trump understands now, that maybe he didn't quite get during his first term. But we don't really have, besides the FBI, we don't really have a federal police force. And now we have the Department of Homeland Security, and we're also seeing these other sort of enforcement agencies within it. And I can't remember the acronyms, but they also are now carrying out operations. So when you see an ICE operation, what maybe looks like an ICE operation is actually something that's being headed by DHS that may be unrelated to immigration. But nonetheless, they're still providing sort of backup. It's like this alphabet soup of weird, enforcement agencies, and everyone's masked up, so nobody knows who they are. But I think he's recognized that this is this ICE, because as it was imagined, or not ICE, DHS, as it was imagined, there was really no restraints or checks or balances.
Yeah.
And this is, so why build up local sort of state law enforcement, or even the FBI, which, has its own, I'm not going to defend the FBI, but he sees it as sort of an enemy, right? He has seen it as an enemy to his own sort of political ambition. Yes, the deep state. So you have this institution with no checks and balances, no real institutional kind of memory, because it's so young. So I think he's revamping it and revolutionizing it in a way to become, that paramilitary force that, fascist movements really, really kind of thrive on. And I was thinking about this as you were talking too. There has been a lot of pushback and protests against these ICE raids and against ICE's presence and the National Guard's presence in Southern California. But what's also interesting is, as you pointed out, there isn't the same. I think we saw it a little bit with the anti-genocide protests, but we don't really see that with I don't know. I'm not trying to say that there isn't the same level of resistance, but it doesn't feel the same. I mean, there are protests happening in Southern LA, but it's like,
Mm.
it's not making the news. It's not making the sort of, it's not coming across, our smartphones in the same way that other things have in the past. And I wonder, like, what your assessment is about that, like this moment of resistance. We had the hashtag resistance under Trump, 1.0, but under Trump 2.0, there's a different sort of element. And I think it has to do also with his strategies, because there's, it's not Antifa versus the Proud Boys now. It's like ICE agents. It's like DHS versus civilians. And, we're talking, it's like the Democrats, I mean, I'm not also going to defend I'm not going to defend the Democrats, but they also played a part in dismantling and demonizing the anti-fascist movements that were there, I think, sounding the alarm bells and creating sort of community capacity to address these issues at the beginning. And so now you can't even have like anything that's considered like direct action is also just labeled categorically illegalism or criminal behavior. And it's not the sort of realm of formal politics. So the Democrats are going to be like, they're actually, in some ways, I feel like they're punishing their detractors within their own, their own sort of progressive milieu to say, this is what you get, for not voting for us. And it's almost like, we see this sort of sheepdogging that's happening right now with even progressive candidates who are coming up, bringing us back into the fold. But anyways, there's a lot there, but I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, because I feel like we're repeating there's a lot of things that are different, but there's also some things that are the same in terms of returning back to this sort of electoralism that we saw under the first Trump administration.
I didn't expect to hear you, Nick, defend the FBI and the Democratic Party today, but dang, I mean, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I think you're right. I'll start with the last point that you made. I think you're right. And you saw this play out during that first 2 weekends of like communal self-defense in LA against ICE, and the performance of Mayor Karen Bass, who's a Democrat, right? Who's long history in the Democratic Party. She was a federal elected representative, and then she ran for mayor of Los Angeles and won. And like, she was essentially making that argument, right? Like, she would say, oh, we're going to protect peaceful protests, and then lie about not using LAPD to help out with ICE, which all of us were watching. Like, no, we watch LAPD going after protesters. And she would constantly make the line, well, we support peaceful protests, peaceful dissent, peaceful expression, First Amendment expressions. But the moment these people get attacked and they respond to ICE, then she plays that role that you just described, right? Well, no, you're that. And it was similar to the way the Democrats talked about Antifa. And Antifa was like a self-defense force, right? But they're always castigated. They were during the first Trump administration as being like innately violent. And I remember having conversations with like liberal colleagues, and they were they were really scared of Antifa, like the imagery, and they were like, they're so violent and they break stuff. And I'm just shaking my head like, man, come on. Yeah, I can imagine how you guys would have reacted to the Black Panther Party of self-defense in the 1960s. You would have been freaked out as well. Groups that were practicing self-defense, the right to self-defense. Why is it why people of color cannot have the right to exercise the right to self-defense? I still, it's like a white liberal thing that they can't accept that. And Karen Bass is interesting because she's like one of these political figures that really encapsulates Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor's description of Black faces in high places in her book on BLM, From BLM to Black Liberation. I mean, like, Karen Bass was like a member of the Venceremos brigades in the early 70s. She went to Cuba as a teenager to go and like harvest sugar. And now she's the mayor of LA, lying to us that she's not allowing or ordering the LAPD to collaborate with ICE to put down peaceful protests that are misrepresented as somehow being violent just because people are defending their loved ones, their neighbors, their community. I think that's a holdover, right? It's just we don't have evil Antifa anymore, or even groups like the John Brown Gun Club who are out there with like, heavy machinery. Now it's nurses and doctors at hospital clinics, getting in the face of ICE agents saying you cannot come in here, teachers not letting them go into elementary schools, priests, bishops. I mean, if there was a moment for this party to be like a little brave, I mean, this is it. And they're for a variety of reasons are failing. But again, like Ta-Nehisi Coates has that quote, right? Like, why are we surprised by this? I mean, they didn't draw the line at genocide. And so Gaza, and the way that the Biden administration and liberal institutions and the Democratic Party crack down on people who were protesting the genocide in Gaza, should have told us that they were unprepared and unwilling to defend this assault on the little democracy that we have. And this is why, I mean, like always, right? We just, the defense and the resistance is going to have to come from below, not from people who are holding signs that say we could be at brunch right now, right? Like, that's not where it's going to come from. I think the preview, what you mentioned about Trump, the preview was his reaction to the BLM protests, the George Floyd uprisings of the summer of 2020, right? It was there when he really started to order an assortment of alphabet soup federal police forces to put down protests and rebellions in that summer, right? Using federal prison bureau guards, using ICE, ordering BORTAC, which is an insane unit within the Border Patrol. I mean, if you guys don't know what BORTAC is, I would just Google it. I mean, this is the special forces unit within the Border Patrol that gets trained in Iraq, that gets trained in Afghanistan. Their videos on YouTube, it's like they're like rappelling off of helicopters, and they look like operators, right? That special operator culture of like they were somehow part of the special forces. They were deployed in Portland during the summer of 2020, and they were disappearing people. They were grabbing people and throwing them into unmarked vans, taking them to black sites, and then after a couple of days releasing them with no charges. So this was all Trump, right? Like, so he, in the face of kind of military reticence to get involved in domestic policing or domestic suppression of amendment rights, he turned to the very people that are now waging this mass war against immigrants and brown communities of color. And it's ICE, and it's the Border Patrol, and it's the Federal Bureau of Prison Guards, it's Homeland Security Investigation Police. I mean, we probably should be better about knowing what all these police corporations are, because there's a lot that most people do not know about. And they're all engaged in these multi-police corporation raids and operations against what they perceive to be migrant communities and migrant individuals. And it's insane, man. I just read that. So they deported 8 migrants who had served prison sentences, right? And they sent them to South Sudan. The Supreme Court prevented ICE from leaving them in the South Sudan. So then they ended up flying to Djibouti, where both the ICE agents and these migrants were living for days on end inside these crates, like shipping crates. And they all got sick, and it was hot. And these people ended up being shipped off and dropped off at some, like, I can't even pronounce the name of the African country. It's like Eswatini or something like that. The idea now, thanks to the Supreme Court, that a migrant can be detained and just dropped off at any corner of the world that the U.S. government decides on, and not that migrant's home country, is terrifying. But that's war on terror shit, right? That's extraordinary rendition. That's, this is one of the, it's not just ICE that's part of that Boomerang, right? It's like extraordinary rendition. It's enforced disappearance. It's black sites. It's the whole legal artifice that they try to create around enemy combatants, right? That has its precedence in like how they fought against different indigenous groups in the 19th century, like the Seminoles. It's one way to understand what's happening today. It's that this is the war on terror unleashed full scale domestically, but through the lens of migration, through long existing lens and ideas about migration, about, and within that, all sorts of things get conflated too, which gives it more power. So you conflate the issue of like refugees and asylum seekers. According to Trump, all of them are quote unquote illegal immigrants. You conflate the issue of drugs and drug trafficking. And this is where Mexico comes in, right? And I've read recently, there was a journalist based in Mexico, Owen Grillo, who said that like he has sources that are telling him that there's like high level internal military discussions within the US talking about military operations in Mexico. You can't coexist for too long with an expansionist project. And I would be terrible. I can't even imagine what some sort of US military operation in Mexico would look like. It'd be horrific. It'd be tragic. But the fact that they're still talking about this, and they have been now for a few years, is a really terrifying prospect. But again, that issue is also kind of trafficked in and packaged as part of this whole illegal immigrant problem that seems to be animating their political project and political base.
Yeah, and I think there was kind of a conceptual misframing of these issues too, because it's like, yeah, these are institutions that are the products of and the artifacts of the U.S. war on terror, and both parties are claiming to have ended the forever wars, but yet are still utilizing the very institutions, domestic and also foreign institutions to continue to wage these wars and to carry out this violence. And it's sometimes I think somebody was saying, I don't know who, I can't remember. I was having a conversation and they were like, well, the U.S. war on terror, those frameworks are no longer useful. It's like, but when did that happen? I mean, is it like, did that end? I mean, did ICE disappear? Did DHS disappear? I don't, if they haven't disappeared, then that, because that's their mandate. And even Trump is saying this, we're ending forever wars. And then it's like, but you're still continuing the war on terror. Like this is the sort of double speak that's coming from both. I mean, what Biden said, we are ending forever wars. We're withdrawing from Afghanistan. And then, Trump is like, I've made a promise to end forever wars. Meanwhile, he's expanding the institutions from those forever wars and also like bombing countries and then supporting the expansionist kind of project of Israel, of greater Israel, to continue bombing all over the place, while also turning his sights towards places like China. I think there's this. I think we're just. I don't know. I'm not trying to sound pessimistic, but I don't know if left movements in the core of empire are really analytically prepared to address these issues. I mean, there's a whole other question about mobilization and movement building. That you and I can't really get into too much detail about, but it's like, it's as if we're in this moment where it's like there's still an unwillingness to really address what is happening and sort of a faith to believe even the very people who are lying to us to say like, these wars are ending. And I think you see that kind of happening right now in the MAGA base, where it's like, you pointed out Epstein, but even, there was questions around, like Tulsi Gabbard's entire career was about ending forever wars. And then she had her Colin Powell moment, at Congress, and was like, Iran possesses weapons of mass destruction. We need to bomb Iran. And no administration has done that. Like the US or the Trump doctrine has actually expanded the Biden doctrine, the Obama doctrine, and the Bush doctrine to now include direct combat and, kinetic military force against Iranian targets. I mean, Trump did this obviously when he assassinated, Soleimani, in his first term, but nonetheless, it's like we're entering I think a new phase. And I don't, I remember being part of those massive mobilizations against the war in Iraq. And I'm not going to say that they weren't effective, but it seemed like there was a general consensus or consciousness around, the movement that this is something that we have to do. But I'm not seeing it in this moment in time. I'm not seeing the same sort of analytical precision. And maybe it's because the flood the field approach by the Trump administration has made it almost impossible to kind of address every single attack. It's like, it's healthcare, it's education, it's all, it's a massive attack. And the Democrats obviously are unwilling and unable to mount an effective resistance. We don't have a third party. We don't have any sort of political options other than to the point where it's like you said, you got rid of Antifa, you made them effective, you criminalized them, you delegitimized them. So now you're basically just saying citizens should go out and defend their relatives against this, anonymous police force that strikes anywhere, anytime. Like it's not leaving a lot of hope for people. It's very dire times.
I don't know, but I think what gives me hope is the level of communal and popular organization in Southern California was there and is there. And they did mount, and they are mounting, I think, a really creative, effective resistance against ICE. From, using tow trucks to go and tow away ICE vehicles because they think they can park anywhere, to organizing nightly loud protests outside of the hotels where ICE agents are staying. and none of these were really spontaneous, right? Like they speak, like the comrades in Southern California will tell you that like these are part of long-standing organizations that have been, some instances go back to like the huge immigrant rallies and marches of 2006 to even beyond that, right? Like you could probably connect the dots from, Central American solidarity campaigns that were created in the 1980s. Some of those veterans, their influence, whether political, ideological, or material, are still felt in some of these organizations that are leading the attack, the defense against ICE and ICE raids into their community. The issue is that we're not seeing the articulation of these local movements onto like a regional or a national level, right? Which has always been a problem, I think, within the US left, particularly. The fact that both Biden and Trump had to speak to like ending forever wars, I think, it speaks to the fact that there is like popular sentiment against, let's say amorphously defined, sometimes confusedly defined, like anti-imperialism. Mm-hmm. The explanations for it tend to differ by political party, right? People on the right are obsessed with like foreign aid. They think that foreign aid forms some huge percentage of the U.S. budget, which is like, it's not. But there is a sentiment there, right? And I think this is why, I think you're right. I mean, Trump obviously is not anti-war. He's not America first. He's expanding forever war in a variety of different ways, really scary ways. Also mixing it with his trademark, just outright cronyism and graft. But there is something there, right? I think that's why both political parties have to like kind of gesture at it. And I wonder, what can we done with that? I mean, I there is something there, but there is a lack of, there isn't like an anti-war political party that represents some sort of viable political threat via electoralism. But there is a sentiment there, and I think we see it with polls that ask Americans about how they feel about the genocide in Gaza, right? Like that's another way to read it as well. Particularly when you start to, teach and write and convey to folks that this is a U.S. Israel genocide. It's not an Israel genocide. This is like there's a reason why the U.S. government can't say this is a genocide, because then they're complicit in the most horrendous of crimes, right? And I think we should keep that in mind. But yeah, I don't know. It's good to it's good to be pessimistic, I think. I mean, I think we want to approach this clear-eyed. And that's the place we're at. I think for me personally, all masks of legitimation that have been stripped away in the last 630 plus days. Even for those of us who are on the left, who research and teach more radical or leftist histories, like I still naively believed in a lot of things that were stripped away after Al-Aqsa flood and the Israeli genocidal response to Gaza. So we are supposed to be, we're in a pessimistic situation, right? The question is how do we get out of it, and how do we think through it? And this is going back to our Anti-Imperialist Scholars Collective. I think that's one of our reasons of being, right? One of the reasons why we came together is to kind of like, how do we get out of this mess? Also, I think thinking about this like latent anti-imperialism or anti-war sentiment that exists within broad swaths of the American population. I remember growing up, particularly in the 90s, the image that the American right wing the way they talked about the UN and like that secret plan that the UN had for the US and black helicopters and booted thugs. I remember in 2015, Operation Jade Helm, when the US military had some sort of secret military exercises in like New Mexico, Texas, and I can't remember the third state, maybe Arizona, and the right wing went crazy. We've had images of like ICE helicopters landing on agricultural fields in Camarillo, California. Where are these people?
Yeah.
They're actually rooting for the helicopters. The helicopters that they're said
flying the helicopters.
Yeah, right. They're flying the helicopters. Like, so there's just like this huge contradiction within the right. But I think it can be exploited. And I think we're seeing it, hopefully, the one thing that gives me a little bit of optimism is like there's cracks in this 30% of America, 35% of Americans who seemingly unconditionally support Trump in this political project. And there's like cracks that are forming now. And I wonder if those will have any sort of consequence. It's good when they're in disarray, but they're caught, like you said, there's just so much. I mean, the one big beautiful bill is just rapid austerity, right? Like it's so many people are going to suffer as a consequence of that bill. They're going to suffer slow deaths. They're going to suffer premature death because they're giving, it's a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom to the top. And it's, so it's hard not to feel pessimistic.
Yeah. And I think it's also like, you can only fuel this base with this propagandistic, jingoistic sort of ideology of America, make America great again, America first, while their teeth are literally rotting out of their skulls, and like they're facing these really tragic, like the floods that happened in Texas, and there's a consequence to this ideology, and it's I think like it's not to I don't justify that violence. Again, I believe that like at some point you're gonna have like decolonization, if you want to use that term. This goes against like what Adam Kirsch, is that his name? Adam Kirsch, the Wall Street Journal guy who wrote the book on settler colonialism.
It doesn't exist. Settler colonialism doesn't exist. Yeah.
Well, it can't exist because if you decolonize, then that means that you have to commit a white genocide. That's
when it exists, right?
Yeah,
that's when it magically appears, when you're waging white genocide.
Exactly. Yeah, that's his argument, and like it's a very pessimistic argument because it's like it's actually feeding this. I mean, in ways that like the base doesn't understand settler colonialism and they're not opposed to it, and that for those reasons, but the message they're being fed is that an alternative to this is like, complete annihilation. So we have to go forward with this project because there is no alternative. Right. And that's a very scary place to be in. I mean, you can get people to do all kinds of crazy things if that's what they believe. And so I do think like, myself as an educator, like I do go back to that and like saying like, we do play a role in this society. And I agree with you, like all this veneer of civility, quote unquote, I'm using that because they say it, there's their term, not mine. Civility, collegiality is completely out the window because these sentiments are very intimate within, our conversations. Like people will say to your face that they support a genocide. I mean, like that's what they're saying. And they'll say, I will remove you from this university. I'll remove you from your professional, position for opposing this genocide. And that's the lengths I'm going to go. And, these are liberals, these are Democrats, these are not like right-wing MAGA people.
While tagging you as a racist.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's not just that they get rid of you. They're like, you're a racist too.
Yeah.
And then that's why we're getting rid of you. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't even want to talk about the white liberals who do that. And that's why they have to throw away DEI. They're like, yeah, we actually need to get rid of this because, it's coming from all these brown folks who are telling us that we're genocide deniers, But I guess like I appreciate your time and I know you got to go, Alex, but like this moment, and I didn't want to minimize like the level of organizing that happens on the ground, especially in Southern LA. These are generational institutions that have trained. And I think people kind of look at the uprisings that are happening as sort of spontaneous and they're not, and I also think about how, in social movements, we're trained with, you go to a pipeline struggle, you go to, these actions and they train you in nonviolent direct action. This whole like industry around nonviolent direct action. And I'm not advocating for violence, but there's something in there that has always troubled me. And this is a conversation I've had with some of my relatives who were part of the water protector movement. It's like, they're telling you to do something that's not natural. When you see somebody like a child getting violated, when you see one of your relatives being taken away, your instinct is for self-defense and self-preservation. And they're teaching you to not do anything. And, it has like, and then when they project it in the media, it's like, with Karen Bass, they're saying that this is, these are irrational, violent thugs who are reacting and engaging in property damage. But it's like we're taught to denaturalize these instincts of self-defense and to also criminalize people who are trying to protect their own relatives and their own families. And I think we're moving beyond this kind of phase where it's like you either resist or you die, or you get your children taken away. The point of these other institutions, Black Panther Party is one. There's many of institutions throughout history that are for self-defense. And the fascists, like we asked what happened to the Proud Boys, in this moment, and said they all became ICE agents. I don't know.
Yeah, they get paid now. They get benefits. Yeah.
And they're organized, and they have, they believe that they're ideologically indoctrinated in a belief that they are defending the American, way of life. They are engaged in a white supremacist sort of struggle. And we can't, we have to look to our own people and seeing they're reacting in the only way they know how. And we shouldn't criminalize or condemn them for that. In fact, we should embrace them and be in solidarity that this is not right, and that this is a natural response to when you're being murdered, when you're being killed, that you have the right, you have the right to self-defense. But
yeah, I think our comrade Justin Padur has written on his Substack quite a bit on how that nonviolent stuff will get you killed, to quote that title. And I can't remember who the historian is who wrote it.
You don't even need to read the book. You just have to read the cover.
And you see the picture, right? The elderly Black woman with that big ass shotgun on her porch. Yeah. No, I mean, there's nothing really that can add on to that. I think it's gonna escalate, man. I mean, at the Camarillo protests, there's videos that look like someone, shooting at ICE agents, right? So like you said, right, like how, people are starting to they have to make these really huge existential decisions on the fly in the face of a baton getting swung at them, or in the face of a masked death squad person. And I think we should start calling that. I mean, that someone died in that raid. So that's that for me. Then that ICE is a death squad. People are going to die in these detention concentration camps that are understaffed. There's, in horrible conditions, that they're death squads, right? So how are people going to react in that moment, in a crazy moment, right? Like if you've been in those moments of a protest and there's police going, it's really hard to kind of calibrate into even make sense of what's going on, but you see a loved one getting taken away. I mean, so I think that's part of the reason why the raids are being done in this way too, right? I almost feel like they want to escalate, the police, these death squads, they're looking toward an escalation to then justify, increased state terrorism. But from the perspective of the people suffering these raids, what do you have left, right? Like, what would you do if we put ourselves in their position? Like, what would you do if your loved one gets taken away in the way that they've been taken away? Yeah, we're in a really, it's bleak. It's in terms of political options at the national level, even at the regional level, it's a bleak moment. But again, as historians, when I teach history, what we teach students, and what I try to teach students, is that things don't have to be this way. Things are this way because of this, but there are alternative models from the past that we can draw on that could offer a way out of it. There's the argument about whether socialism could exist in the US, that goes back to more than 100 years, right? That goes back to even before W.B. Du Bois. Why can't socialism exist in a settler colonial project at the United States? I mean, this is a debate that happened in the late 19th century, happened in the early 20th century. So, engaging in those type of debates and offering solutions based on your historical reading of those moments, I think is part of what we can do, right? Like one of the things that we can do as historians and as scholars that are invested in kind of recuperating and thinking through past moments of revolutionary transformation and alternative ways of organizing society. And this is, there's individual scholars like Walter Rodney that we mentioned, like W.B. Du Bois. There's a whole host of Latin American scholars that inspire me to excavate that past and to offer just to even show that their alternative models are possible. Like, what happens if we kind of think about that and recontextualize them for the present? And once you start critically interrogating our current situation, I think anything is possible.
Yeah, that's a good way. That's a good way to end it. And Alex, we're gonna have you back on soon, hopefully, because there's so much to talk about. We didn't even get into the third topic I wanted to address, is settler colonialism in Latin America. Maybe that's a whole
It exists. It exists.
It exists.
But
The answer is
talk
it exists.
About it. It exists. Yeah. Thanks, man. Yeah, looking forward to it. Thank you.
I appreciate it. And your latest piece is on foreignexchange.news. It's the American Maginot Line, Part 3, the Gringo Dome and Palestine-Mexico border. Check it out. We'll put a link in the show notes for folks. It's a 3-part series if you don't know what the Maginot Line is, you're probably not going to learn about it in this
Not
piece.
today.
But you're going to learn a lot about
Google it.
yeah, Google it. But you're going to learn a lot about ask Grok. But I appreciate it, man. Where can people check out your work and follow you?
I'm still on Twitter at Alexander_Aviña. I write for foreign exchanges periodically. That I've turned that American Maginot Line into a series. So I think the next piece will be more on kind of like Israel and Mexico, and Israel furthering settler colonialism and oppressive relationships with indigenous communities in Mexico. That'll be out someday. I also have a website, alexanderavina.com, that I need to update at some point. But yeah, I think you could find me on Twitter or our little ecosphere of a podcast that we're constantly on.
All right, man. Appreciate it.
Thank you.